It was a cool spring morning in 1961. The kitchen smelled of percolated coffee and buttered toast, and sunlight caught the chrome edges of the Frigidaire, casting small rainbows across the yellow Formica countertop. A $1 bill lay folded beside the sugar bowl, crisp, deliberate, waiting. She stood there in her cotton house dress, the same pale blue one she'd sewn herself last autumn, and stared at that dollar the way a chess player studies the board. Her husband had left it there after breakfast, loose change from his weekly paycheck. $47.50 he brought home every Friday, cash in a brown envelope with his name typed across the front. This particular dollar was supposed to go toward groceries, but she had other plans. Outside, the neighborhood hummed with the gentle rhythm of early 60s suburbia. A Nash Rambler idled at the corner. Children's voices drifted through open windows. Somewhere down the block, someone was mowing their lawn, and the smell of cut grass mixed with the faint sweetness of honeysuckle climbing the back fence. Everything felt ordered, hopeful, carefully arranged. America was building itself into something modern, something gleaming. But in kitchens like hers, across thousands of small towns and city blocks, women were building something else entirely, something quieter, more resilient. The year was 1961, and the average American household earned about $5,700 annually. That sounds modest now, but back then it meant something. It meant a 3-bedroom house could be purchased for around $12,000. It meant a gallon of milk cost 49 cents, a loaf of Wonder Bread 21 cents, and you could fill your car's tank with gas for less than $3. A new Ford Galaxy sat in showrooms for $2,600, gleaming and huge, a symbol of everything the decade promised. But those numbers only tell half the story. The other half lived in the space between paychecks, in the worn leather of a housewife's purse, in the careful calculations she made while pushing a metal cart down the fluorescent aisles of the A&P. She knew every price by heart. She knew which day the butcher marked down yesterday's roast. She knew that buying margarine instead of butter saved 11 cents, and that those 11 cents saved every week became $5.72 by year's end, enough for a new winter coat for her youngest. Women didn't have their own credit cards in 1961. Most couldn't open a bank account without their husband's signature. The financial world spoke to men in dark suits behind mahogany desks, while women learned a different language entirely, one of substitution, patience, and invisible mathematics. They clipped coupons from Ladies' Home Journal and Good Housekeeping, studied the store circulars that arrived each Wednesday, and built elaborate systems of saving that would have impressed any Wall Street accountant if anyone had bothered to look. The banks offered savings accounts with interest rates hovering around 3.5%. Respectable, they called it. Safe. "Put your money with us," the advertisements said, showing families smiling beneath bank logos, their futures secured by institutional trust. But she had learned something the banks didn't advertise. She had learned that security wasn't always about interest rates or vault doors. Sometimes it was about knowing exactly where every dollar lived, what it was meant to do, and when it would be needed. Her mother had taught her this, her grandmother before that. Not through formal lessons, but through observation, through quiet demonstrations at kitchen tables when the bills came due and the paycheck had already been divided into careful piles. There was rent money, always first, $38 for their 2-bedroom apartment before they'd managed to buy the house, utility money, grocery money, church offering, doctor fund, each category sacred, inviolable. She poured herself another cup of coffee from the percolator, the kind that bubbled up into a glass knob at the top, dark and strong. The radio on the counter played softly, WCBS probably, or one of those stations that mixed news with easy listening music. President Kennedy had been in office only a few months. The Bay of Pigs invasion would happen soon, though she didn't know that yet. She only knew that the world felt balanced on something precarious, and the best thing she could do was make sure her own small corner stayed steady. That dollar on the counter represented more than 100 cents. It represented choice. It represented the difference between reactive living and intentional living. The bank wanted her to believe that saving meant depositing, that security meant letting them hold her money and pay her back pennies of interest while they used it for their own purposes. But what she did next with that single dollar wasn't in any magazine or money guide. It was something banks would never understand. She picked up the dollar and smoothed it flat against the countertop, running her thumb along its edges. Then she opened the drawer beside the sink, the junk drawer, her husband called it, though there was nothing junky about the way she organized it, and pulled out a small manila envelope. Written on the front in her careful cursive, Christmas Fund. Inside were 6 more dollars, each one folded the same way, each one extracted from a week's grocery budget through small acts of genius. A sale on chuck roast meant 70 cents saved. Day-old bread from the bakery meant another 25. Making coffee at home instead of buying it downtown when she ran errands meant 35 more. Those pennies and dimes and quarters accumulated, were converted to bills, and disappeared into envelopes that lived in that drawer, behind the scissors and the ball of twine and the spare buttons. This was the trick the banks hated, though hated is perhaps too strong a word. They couldn't hate what they didn't fully see. But if they had understood the scale of it, the millions of women across America operating their own private financial systems, keeping cash in envelopes and coffee cans and cookie jars, building reserves that never touched a bank ledger, they might have worried. Because this was money in motion that they couldn't track, couldn't profit from, couldn't leverage. She called it her envelope system, though she didn't know that other women called it the same thing, that this method had been passed down through generations of mothers who understood that control mattered more than interest rates. Every Friday, when her husband came home with his pay envelope, she would sit at the kitchen table with a pencil and a piece of paper and divide the money into purposes. Rent and utilities came first. Those were non-negotiable. Then groceries calculated to the dollar. Then clothing fund, doctor fund, card repair fund, Christmas fund, vacation fund. The vacation fund was her favorite. They were saving for a week at a cabin in the Catskills, something they'd done once before marriage and dreamed of doing again with the children. She imagined the cool mountain air, the smell of pine trees, her husband fishing in the early morning while she sat on the porch with a book. That dream cost $200, an astronomical sum, but she'd been building toward it for 2 years. The envelope currently held $83, and every time she added another bill, she felt the dream solidify, become more real. But envelopes were only part of it. She also collected S&H green stamps, those little perforated rectangles handed out at grocery stores and gas stations, 1 stamp for every 10 cents spent. She kept them in special books, moistening each stamp with a small sponge, never her tongue, that was unsanitary, and pressing them into neat rows. Other women in the neighborhood did the same, and sometimes they would trade. She needed 2 more books to get a set of Corningware dishes, and Mrs. Henderson down the street was willing to trade stamps for homemade jam. This was the hidden economy of 1961 Housewives, a barter and savings network that operated parallel to the official financial system. Women traded stamps, coupons, recipes, advice. They formed informal savings clubs, each contributing $2 or $3 a week to a pool, then rotating who got the full amount. If you needed $50 for a washing machine repair, the club made it possible without going to a bank, without interest, without paperwork or mail approval. Every penny counts, she used to say to her children when they begged for candy at the five and dime, not as a denial, but as an explanation. Every penny was a tiny brick in a larger structure she was building, a structure called stability, or maybe dignity, or maybe just the quiet confidence that came from knowing she could handle whatever came next. The magazines understood this, even if they romanticized it. Good Housekeeping ran endless articles about stretching budgets, turning leftovers into new meals, sewing clothes from patterns, making your own cleaning solutions. Woman's Day published coupon roundups and shopping strategies. These weren't presented as poverty measures, but as virtues, as evidence of a woman's skill in managing her domain. A good wife could make $1 do the work of two, they said, and there was pride in that, even if there was also exhaustion. She remembered one particularly lean month when her husband's hours had been cut at the factory. Instead of panicking, she had gone to her envelopes, redistributed resources, stretched the grocery budget through careful meal planning, beans and rice, oatmeal for breakfast, cheap cuts of meat transformed through long, slow cooking. They never missed a payment. The children never went hungry. And when her husband's hours returned to normal, she quietly rebuilt those envelopes, $1 at a time. The bank would have offered her a loan for that month. 3% interest, they would have said. Very reasonable. But then she would have owed money, would have been paying back more than she borrowed, would have been working for their profit instead of her own security. She didn't trust the bank's promises. She trusted herself, and somehow that made every dollar worth 10. She placed the newest dollar into the Christmas envelope and sealed it, then returned it to the drawer. In 7 months, she would withdraw those savings and transform them into wrapped presents under a tinsel tree, into her children's delighted faces, into the fulfillment of small promises she'd made throughout the year. The bank could never offer her that kind of satisfaction. They dealt in abstractions, numbers on paper, percentages, projections. She dealt in results, in tangible security, in the weight of cash in her hand when it was needed. Outside, the milkman rattled past in his white truck. The mailman would arrive at 11. Dinner would be pork chops, on sale this week, with green beans from last summer's garden that she'd canned herself. Life moved in its predictable rhythm, and underneath it all, her envelopes waited in their drawer like soldiers at attention, ready for whatever battle came next. The women of 1961 didn't call themselves financial planners or budget experts. They were just housewives, a term that would later become complicated, questioned, reimagined. But in that moment, in those particular years, they were the architects of household survival. And their methods, however invisible, however unacknowledged, shaped the economic resilience of an entire generation. What she practiced in her kitchen, with her envelopes and her careful calculations, was a form of fiscal discipline that no business school taught. It was wisdom born from constraint, from necessity, from the particular challenges of managing a family's resources when you had no independent income, no legal financial identity separate from your husband, no credit in your own name. The Equal Credit Opportunity Act wouldn't arrive until 1974, 13 years in her future. Until then, she and millions like her operated in a shadow economy of cash and cunning. There was something almost revolutionary about it, though she wouldn't have used that word. By keeping money out of the bank, by circulating it through informal networks of women, by building savings through tiny acts of discipline rather than institutional interest, she was claiming a kind of power the system hadn't intended to give her. The bank saw her as a dependent, a secondary account holder at best. But in her kitchen, with her envelopes arranged by purpose and her green stamp books filled and her mental inventory of every price in every store, she was a financial master. Her children absorbed these lessons without knowing it. They learned to wait, to save, to distinguish between wanting and needing. They learned that security came from preparation, that stability was built in small increments, that the future could be shaped by present choices. Years later, when they managed their own households, they would find themselves unconsciously replicating her methods, setting aside money for specific purposes, building emergency funds, approaching purchases with careful deliberation. The broader culture was moving in a different direction. Credit cards were beginning to proliferate, though they were still uncommon in 1961. Department stores offered charge accounts. The economy was encouraging consumption, spending, buying on installment. America was building a lifestyle based on debt, on the promise of future income paying for present desires. But she resisted that tide, perhaps instinctively understanding that freedom came from owing nothing, from having reserves, from being able to weather disruption without borrowing. Consider the mathematics of her approach. That 3.5% interest the bank offered would have turned her Christmas fund of $83 into $85.90 over a year, less than $3 of gain, and only accessible if she left the money untouched for the full term. But by keeping it liquid, by maintaining direct control, she could respond to emergencies without penalty fees or early withdrawal charges. She could lend $20 to her sister when times were hard, knowing she could rebuild that envelope before December. The bank's $2.90 profit couldn't compete with that kind of flexibility. There was something emotional component too, something harder to quantify, but equally valuable. When she opened that drawer and saw her envelopes, each one representing a specific hope or security measure, she felt capable. She felt like she was steering her life rather than being carried by it. The bank statement that arrived once a month, with its impersonal columns of numbers, couldn't provide that same visceral confidence. Her system was tangible, touchable, immediate. The magazines of that era tried to capture this in their articles, but they always softened it, made it quaint. They published features about penny pinching with cheerful illustrations of smiling housewives holding piggy banks. But the reality was more complex, more impressive. These women were performing high-level resource management under conditions that would challenge any modern financial advisor. They were doing it without computers, without spreadsheets, without credit scores or automatic transfers or financial planning apps, just paper, pencil, and extraordinary mental discipline. By the time the decade ended, some things would begin to change. The women's movement would start questioning these traditional roles. Economic opportunities would gradually expand. But in 1961, in that kitchen, with that single dollar, she was working with the tools available to her, and she was wielding them with remarkable skill. Her husband knew about the envelopes, of course. Sometimes he would ask how much was in the vacation fund, and she would tell him, and he would nod with satisfaction. He earned the money, but he understood that she made it work, made it stretch, made it accomplish far more than its face value suggested. There was a partnership in that, unspoken but real. He brought home the paycheck, she transformed it into a life. Years from now, when she was gone, her children would find those habits embedded in themselves like genetic code. They would catch themselves folding dollars a certain way, organizing receipts, mentally calculating unit prices in grocery stores. They would find themselves resistant to unnecessary debt, careful about large purchases, always maintaining some reserve for emergencies. And they would realize these weren't just practical skills, but inheritances, gifts from a woman who had built stability from almost nothing. The bank never knew what it was missing. It never calculated the lost deposits, the foregone interest income, the loans not taken. It continued operating according to its own logic, focused on the customers it could see and measure. Meanwhile, in kitchens across America, women like her were building their own economic infrastructure, invisible but indestructible. Maybe the trick was never about the dollar at all. Maybe it was about faith, care, and a kind of strength you can't measure in interest rates. It was about understanding that security isn't always what institutions promise you, but what you build for yourself with patience and attention. It was about knowing that sometimes the best investment isn't in a bank vault, but in your own competence, your own discipline, your own ability to navigate uncertainty. The morning light shifted, moving across the kitchen floor as the sun climbed higher. She rinsed her coffee cup and set it in the drainer, then checked her shopping list for the afternoon trip to the grocery store. Chicken was on sale this week, 39 cents a pound. She would buy 2 whole fryers, cut them up herself to save the extra cost of pre-cut pieces, and freeze half for later. The money saved would go into the envelope marked school clothes, because September was always coming and children were always growing. That single dollar might be gone now, but the lesson it carried still whispers through time. It speaks of resourcefulness, of quiet determination, of the remarkable things ordinary people can accomplish when they pay attention to what matters. It reminds us that financial security isn't always about how much you earn, but what you do with what you have. And it honors the millions of women who built the foundation of modern American prosperity, one careful decision at a time, $1 at a time, in kitchens that smelled of coffee and toast, while the sun caught the chrome edges of the stove.